This is Dr. Jerome Corsi, and we're really pleased today to have a guest, Joel Gilbert, who is a filmmaker. And Joel and I go way back. We've had years of working together. I've any number of his DVDs, which are great. He goes back to exploring Obama's real father, Frank Marshall Davis. He's done a great DVD on Utopia, exposing all the socialist myths of how wonderful life is going to be down the yellow brick road. And I love how Joel does his work. It's always a quest to find out. Now, Joel's most recent work is Michelle Obama 2024. He's got a DVD, Only the Truth Can Stop Her, her real life story and plan for power. Okay, and it comes with a book too. There's a book, Michelle Obama 2024. Now, Joel was actually the first one to mention to me, going back probably a year ago, that he suspected that Michelle was being groomed to run for president. The time he first presented it, I said, oh no, she's never going to run for president. And then as I thought about it and watched the politics develop, I've come to the conclusion that Joel was right all along. Now, if that's the case, Michelle is going to be a force to be contended with. And what Joel's work demonstrates is that we're not being told the truth about who Michelle Obama really is. Okay, and so the fascinating part is how Joel goes on this quest to find out. And by the way, it's not easy. I mean, Joel travels, he gets yearbooks, he goes to high schools, he does all kinds of things to get the truth. It's a real investigative journalist experiment, and I want to detail how this is put together. So welcome, Joel. It's great to have you back again.
Thanks, Jerry. Great to be back here with you.
Okay, let's get right into it. I mean, you start out with this book, and the very first chapter goes back to when Michelle was really a little girl.
Right.
And it's the cult of Michelle is chapter 1. And you said, as 2018 rolled into 2019 and 2019 into 2020, I became increasingly aware that Michelle Obama was, well, everywhere. I thought there was a chance that she would step out of the public eye after the release of her autobiography, Becoming, in November 2018, but she didn't. Okay, so you go into the cult of Michelle. What is the cult of Michelle?
The cult of Michelle is a whole series of behaviors and media narratives that turn Michelle into a pop culture phenomenon and the most popular person in the country. And it involves Michelle doing hundreds of interviews over the years that are all positive and fawning and reverent toward her. Michelle doing book tours where she sold out stadiums around the country. Michelle partnering with all kinds of charity organizations to do outreach to women and minority groups. Michelle with her 2 autobiographies where she was interviewed by celebrities, and a number of books that were written about her childhood and that almost look like things that take quotes from everything she ever said, like Mao's Little Red Book. They've got one for Michelle, everything she ever said. So the media has hyped her for 15 years to create this persona that is beloved. She has 100 million followers on all her social media, and she creates news wherever she goes. She showed up in Spain as a background singer for Bruce Springsteen recently. She gives kind of nasty political innuendos from time to time, like she did about a week ago. She did a podcast where she said, government does everything for us. People don't realize that, and trickle down doesn't work. So that's her way of reiterating the socialist themes that government controls everything as the socialist ideal requires, and that the free market system doesn't work. So you need the government for that. So Michelle is kind of omnipresent, and she's created this cult of personality whereby she's the most popular person in the country.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you say at the end of this chapter 1, you say you became convinced she was angling for the Democratic nomination in 2024, and you were becoming convinced of that. You said, convinced that Michelle planned to be the nominee for president, I headed for the one place that held the evidence I needed to flesh out the real Michelle Obama, Chicago.
That's right.
And now we get into the Democrat machine daddy.
Right.
So who is the Democratic machine daddy?
Well, this is a good starting point to understand who Michelle really is and how much she is a political animal, as Aristotle would have called her. She grew up in politics. Her father was a precinct captain working for the Democrat Party machine. Michelle has admitted that. Her father had something called a patronage job, and that means it was a job that the Democrat Party machine gave him at the water department as an inspector. So he could show up a couple times a day and say, hey, everything looks good, and go home and continue his politicking. He got a very good salary for doing not much, but his main job was to convince the black population in his neighborhood to come out and vote for the white liberal Democrat Party machine. That was his job. And Michelle writes about, since she was 4 years old, she was going around with her father doing politicking, people coming to their house and asking for money, and her father being a fixer. So Michelle grew up in a political family and was very much elite. The family got all kind of privileges. Michelle and her brother, for example, refused to study at the school that was one block away at high school, South Shore High School, because it was all black. They sent their kids to a Catholic school. Her brother Craig, even though they weren't Catholic, expensive private school. Michelle went an hour and a half away to a magnet school. Michelle also didn't really have any black friends except for those that were elite. She was friends with Santita Jackson, Jesse Jackson's daughter, and Michelle talks about growing up in Jesse Jackson's house, literally, when he was running for president. So she was all politics all the time growing up. She was on the student council at her magnet school. So that was her experience. Now, she did have some big problems, which you can talk about later, especially with the black kids that accused her of being white, of acting white and talking white, and would beat her up. So we can get into that later. But I just want you to understand in this chapter, Michelle's foundation in politics. She said she fell in love with Barack later when he was giving a political speech because she liked his politics. So in marrying a politician, she kind of married her father. So the cover story they've put out for years that Michelle doesn't like politics is completely phony. She is extremely political, and she's really all politics all the time.
Well, and then you go from there to the white girl on the South Side.
Right.
What's that all about?
Well, we find out, look, Michelle was open about it in her autobiography, and even she kind of talked too much in her 50-city book tour where she would have to describe stories to the audiences for hours. And she talks and writes about how the black kids considered her to be a white girl. The black girls would make fun of her and tell her she's talking white and acting white, and they'd beat her up. Michelle talks about getting in a fist fight with a girl named Dee Dee who called her an Oreo, which is a racial insult. It means you're black on the outside, but you're really white on the inside. Michelle writes about having Mary Tyler Moore as her hero growing up. She watched the Brady Bunch every day. When Barack met her, he said she reminded him of his grandmother from Kansas, his white grandmother. And the family was like Leave It to Beaver from the 50s sitcom. So Michelle really had nothing to do with the black community. She was afraid of them. She even says, I got her on tape, she says, I was afraid to go out of my house because the black kids would beat her up. So this kind of is interesting because for politics, despite having a terrible relationship with the black community, which she really had none because she also refused to study with them, as I mentioned, for politics, Michelle pretends to be one of these ordinary black folks from the South Side of Chicago that overcame all these obstacles and racism. In fact, Michelle's not from the South Side of Chicago. She's from South Shore, which was an upper middle class community on Lake Michigan. Michelle went to an exclusive high school. She went to Paris in high school with her French class, So she's not from the South Side. She never suffered discrimination. She was in a dance class for 12 years, jazz and tap music, going to Paris. And the black kids wanted nothing to do with her, and she wanted nothing to do with them. But for politics, she creates a phony story that I grew up on the South Side, I suffered discrimination. And the idea is to communicate, I'm just like you. Give me the power, give me your votes, because I'm one of you. She's not one of these ordinary black folks. She actually had nothing to do with the black community. And we'll talk about later in her career how she exploited the black community to make money on behalf of white liberals.
It's fascinating because your chapter 4 is on the run from Black America.
Right.
Now, that's pretty fascinating. Go into that, please.
Well, look, Michelle is the black face of white flight. In her political speeches, she likes to tell stories that in the 1970s, her and her brother witnessed white flight, that white people moved out of their neighborhood. And she said, quote unquote, y'all were running from us and you're still running. And she said things like, putting on her phony urban accent. And she said things like, they were afraid of the color of our skin and the texture of our hair. Well, in reality, I found out that the South Shore neighborhood that Michelle moved into at age 6 was mostly white and Jewish up until 1965. And that's when the Jewish people kind of moved out because of crime. I spoke to the woman who sold Michelle's house where she grew up to her aunt. And she told me the reason they moved was because of crime, that her son got assaulted. I talked to one of Michelle's neighbors, a Korean kid, was actually Michelle's first kiss in first grade. She's talked about that. And he told me they moved because their house got ransacked. So they were experiencing a lot of crime in the mid-60s, and that's what drove the white population out. And then the black middle class moved in because they were good homes and it had good schools. And even Jesse Jackson, who moved to South Shore, said at the time that the housing prices went up when the white people moved out because so many middle-class blacks moved in and snapped up those homes. So when Michelle says that when she moved into the area at 6 years old in 1971, the whites were long gone. So Michelle's phony story that, in the 70s, I saw white people moving out because they were afraid of our skin color, completely made up and false. Michelle was the black face of white flight. It was her and her brother that refused to study with other black kids. There was a beautiful school called South Shore High School, 1 block from their house. Beautiful school, but it was all black. And her parents didn't want the black kids, or what they perceived as their educational level, dragging down their kids. So her brother Craig, not Catholic, but they paid a lot of money to send him to a white Catholic school an hour away. Michelle goes to a magnet school. So Michelle is the black face of white flight, but she lies to manipulate black and minority voters, trying to establish some street cred that I suffered discrimination, I'm one of you, when in fact the very opposite is true.
What I like about your film is you go to Chicago. You spend a lot of time in Chicago. You track down her high school. I mean, as I recall, you even got her yearbooks. Is that correct?
Yeah, I got her yearbooks. I spoke to her high school classmates. I still talked to her high school guidance counselor. One of them, not the one that Michelle talks about a lot, is the one who passed away, Nan King, in 2005. But I talked to another high school counselor who told me who Michelle's counselor was. And Michelle's another phony, fake racial hoax story she's been telling for years is that her high school counselor racially profiled her regarding Michelle applying to Princeton University. And Michelle tells this to Gayle King on a video interview about a year ago. She says, the counselor told her, "You're black, applying to Princeton, maybe you're stretching." And Michelle talks about being racially profiled. Well, I found out her guidance counselor was a church-going black woman named Nan King. Now, Michelle's gotten away with this story because Nan King died in 2005. But Nan King was an assistant principal as well, black woman. There's no way she racially profiled her. The worst thing she could have said was, Michelle, your test scores are so low, you might not get into Princeton. They really require high test scores. You might want to apply to some backups. That's the worst thing she could have told her. But that's another fake racial story Michelle tells because she has no street cred with the black community. She has no connection to them. So she makes up these phony stories thinking that that will endear her to the black community. I did talk to her elementary school classmates, elementary school principal, a number of people, including Michelle's mother, and a completely different picture emerges of Michelle Obama as an elitist, as a political kid from a political family who had nothing to do with any black people growing up.
You even knock on in the film, you can see you knocking on the mother's door and but you going into the school, talking to all these people. That's the fun part of the DVD is you get to see all this and hear the actual interactions of your investigation, which is really fascinating. So then Michelle ends up at Princeton. You say escape to and from blackness. Yeah,
pretty interesting investigation I did of Michelle's time at Princeton. It included my talking for hours to her thesis advisor and sociology professor at Princeton, which no one has ever done. And what we learned from Princeton is Michelle went there. but I think she was more comfortable with white people. She always was. She was never comfortable with the black community. They made fun of her. They beat her up. They called her white. And she didn't want to be with black people that knew what she was really all about. And so Princeton was a good solution for her. Her brother was on the basketball team there. That's one reason she might have gotten in with low test scores. Plus, affirmative action was very big in the Ivy Leagues in those years. And I found out, of course, Michelle had written about and talked about how in high school she did not do well on tests, but she did get good grades because she studied double the time. She said, I had to study double as much as everybody else to get good grades, but she couldn't study that much for, on a test. She did poor on tests. So in her first semester at Princeton, Michelle does very poorly with her grades, and that upsets her a lot. The white girl in her wanted to get straight A's all the time. So she escaped to the sociology department at Princeton because sociology was relatively easy to major in that. It's the same thing her brother did. Her brother got low test scores in engineering, and he went and flipped to sociology because it's kind of easy. Then Michelle took an even easier major of African-American studies, of all things. So she gets into this African-American studies program, and this is when the black professors were kind of radicalizing. They were actually authoring critical race theory in the early 80s when Michelle was there. That's where this stuff was kind of invented. And Michelle gets taught by her African-American studies professor, who I talked to. She gets taught, you're black, you're only going to be black. No one's ever going to think of you as anything but black. And you're going to be black the rest of your life, and you're just a member of this black community. You're not going to be part of America. That's what she's taught. And she knows, though, that in Chicago, when she worked hard, everybody accepted her at her white school, that she always could work hard, and people didn't consider her only to be black. So she kind of rebelled against this radical testing and preaching and lectures with her thesis, which no one ever read but me, and never talked to her thesis advisor. And in the thesis, she actually says that having been at Princeton, she's more comfortable with white people, that she wants to get a corporate job and make a lot of money and be part of the country. But her professors are telling her that you're black and there's nothing else you can do in life. So she takes a survey of the black alumni who've graduated already from Princeton and asks them, do you want to be just in the black community, or do you want to move on and be part of America? And to her relief, they say, no, we don't. We just want to be part of the country. We're not stuck as a stereotype, because her professors taught her you're only going to be a stereotype. So she rejects all this radical black professor nonsense she's been taught, and then moves on to Harvard, and of course gets a job in Sidley Austin and marries a biracial man and works only with white people. So it's interesting how she kind of got stuck in this radical black program because she wanted, easy, good grades. One of her classmates who studied engineering actually wrote, she said, why in the world would I go to Princeton? As a black girl, another black girl from Chicago, she said, why would I go to Princeton to study about being black? She said, I'm aware that I'm black. I don't want that to be the center of my education. But Michelle copped out at Princeton by studying sociology and African-American studies to keep good grades. So that's kind of her story at Princeton. Even though she rejected the radical black theories that she was taught at the time, later she was able to rely on those theories to try to inflame the black community to get power. And she does kind of go back to some of that teaching she had to manipulate the black community for politics.
Yeah, and she comes after Princeton. She comes back to Chicago and gets involved with Bernardine Dorn, who,
right.
And Chris, the producer, you had a picture of Bernardine Dorn a minute ago. Where Joel's going to explain who she is and why she was, the apprentice. It played this role to apprentice Michelle into more radical views. So explain that to us. How did that go, Joel?
Okay, so Bernardine Dorn was one of the heads of the Weather Underground terrorist group in the 60s. She is accused of murdering a policeman in San Francisco. Larry Grathwall was an undercover agent with the Weather Underground. He told me that Bill Ayers, her husband, told him that Bernardine had assembled and planted the bomb that killed a police officer, Brian McDonough, in San Francisco. And she was, radical domestic terrorist. They wanted to overthrow the government and replace it with a communist manifesto. She'd been to Vietnam, meeting the revolutionaries, Cuba. So Bernardine Dohrn was a very serious domestic terrorist in the 60s. And somehow she she spent a few months in jail at one time, but her and her husband were able to avoid serious jail sentences. And Bernardine Dohrn ended up working at the Sidley Austin law firm, 2,000 attorneys in a skyscraper in downtown Chicago. And Michelle ended up there when she got out of Harvard Law. And Michelle and Bernardine Dohrn become fast friends. So much so that Michelle mimicked all of the Bernardine Dohrn anti-American rhetoric when she first appeared on the campaign trail in 2008. People remember Michelle talked about fear, the politics of fear. Things like, you can't pay your mortgage, you can't afford food in this country, don't get sick in this country. People kind of didn't really understand, where in the world does this come from? Someone that went to Princeton and Harvard. Well, it came because she was radicalized by Bernardine Dohrn. She quotes Bernardine Dohrn word for word. But Michelle and Barack, who was friends with her husband, Bill Ayers, they went to dinners at the Dohrn-Ayers household for years, in the 90s and up till he ran for U.S. Senate. So you can't overstate the amount of influence that these domestic terrorists had on the Obamas and on U.S. policy. And Michelle's relationship with Bernardine Dohrn really speaks to why she became so radicalized.
And also opened up the door for Barack Obama to become radicalized. Of course, he'd started that in Hawaii with Frank Marshall Davis, which you explored earlier very effectively. Right. So now she gets to City Hall, and your chapter 7 is selling out the Black community. I mean, this is a fascinating story. So she's now back in Chicago, and what happens?
Yeah, well, she works at Sidley Austin Law Firm with Bernardine Dohrn for 2 years, and she's representing Barney the Dinosaur, Coors Beer. And Michelle decides, instead of working at this law firm, which is a lot of tough work, 15, 16 hours a day, she uses the excuse that she stopped working at the law firm because her father passed away. And I find out that what Michelle has said about her father passing away was a lie. I don't know why she lies about something like that. Michelle claimed that her father was sick in the hospital at University of Chicago Medical Center. She spent the afternoon and evening with him, and she claims that she left his bedside at night and she went home, and in the morning she got a phone call that her father had died during the night. It's a total lie. I got a copy of her father's death certificate, and he actually died at 3:50 in the afternoon was the time of death. And it's probably likely that Michelle was at her law office and probably hadn't seen him for a week or two. And she got the call that her father passed away. But she does invent a complete and total lie about her father's death to sound very sympathetic. I spent the time with my father. He passed away during the night. So sad. But she lies about that. She lies about many things to try to make herself appear in good light. But she decides to stop working at Sidley Austin, where she had to work very long hours. And Barack and her had arranged for her to get these grant money to start a community organizing group called Public Allies. And Michelle actually had Bernardine Dohrn as a guest speaker. And this was an organization where it was kind of like deep state training. They would take people that were down on their luck. You got out of prison, you didn't graduate from high school, and they'd give you a job in the bureaucracy of the Chicago government for 10 months. But once a week, you would come for radicalization with Michelle and Bernardine Dohrn and others. And the idea was, when these people graduate after 10 months from our program of Public Allies, they'll get permanent jobs in the bureaucracy and work their way up over the years. It's kind of like the definition of the deep state, really the Weather Underground idea, the socialist idea. We're going to penetrate the government with radicals and then take it over one day. So that's what Michelle was into as a community organizer. So she did that for 3 years, and then she found out that the mayor's office was being sued by black organizations because Richard Daley didn't have any black people really working in his administration. So they were looking for black people to come in, and Michelle was told to go interview with Valerie Jarrett, and she did, and she was immediately offered a job to become assistant planning commissioner under Valerie Jarrett. And the main job at that time was the Democrat Party donor developers like Tony Rezko really wanted the project real estate. There were these projects built in the 1950s that were away from downtown. But by 1990, downtown had expanded, and now the projects were downtown. And the donors wanted this real estate to build condos and make a ton of money with exclusive properties. So they got this idea, let's knock down the projects. Let's kick 20,000 black people out of their homes. They've been there for 40 years. And we'll give the money to our donors. We'll give the land to our donors. So this is Michelle's beginning of her road, that whenever white liberals had problems with black people and they needed to solve them, and they couldn't hire a white person for it, they needed a black person, Michelle would take that job. So Michelle helped to kick 20,000 black people out of their homes, knock down their homes, and Michelle told them, it's going to be good for you. This is better for you to lose your home. Now, I think the psychology of it was Michelle was never part of the black community. And I think part of it for her was getting her revenge on the black community for what they did to her growing up and how they treated her. So she had no qualms. Instead of saying, well, I work for the mayor, we don't want to knock down and make all these people homeless. I'm black, I understand these people. No, she was happy to do it and make a lot of money doing it. So that's her big contribution at the mayor's office, was kicking 20,000 black people out of their homes. They did knock down the projects and they built condos. And Michelle told the deported people, it's going to be good for you.
It's an amazing story. I mean, you begin to really get deeply into the character here, and the race is a theme all the way through. But it's the story you just told, and this whole ambivalence towards being black. So you get down to the selling out the black community at the University of Chicago, and then the Black authenticity marriage crisis.
Yeah.
So we're at a key point in her life, and what's going on?
Well, having proven she could do the dirty work for the white liberals at the mayor of Chicago's office for the city, the University of Chicago Medical Center was also having a lot of problems with black people. The Southsiders were coming up and using their emergency room, and a lot of them didn't have good insurance. So the University of Chicago Medical Center, even though they were a public facility, they got public grants, they were still losing millions, and they didn't have enough space for the Hyde Park white people that needed hospital rooms. So they hired Michelle for $300,000 a year. Today, that's a ton of money, but imagine in 2005, $300,000 a year. Michelle took this job to head up something called the Southside Health Collaborative. And the idea was that if you were black and showed up at the emergency room, Michelle would put you in a white van and dump you back on the South Side at these crappy clinics. The University of Chicago Medical Center made a deal with these really crappy clinics in strip malls. They said, if we have people show up here, we're going to dump them on you. And the clinics were happy. Well, we'd like to get some patients, and maybe we'll make a little money. So if you showed up and you were black, Michelle would dump you. And it was illegal. Patient dumping was a specific law against that Ronald Reagan passed. You're not allowed to choose patients. You're not allowed to kick patients out that don't have good insurance and keep the ones that do have good insurance. It was completely illegal. Today, Michelle could be charged with a hate crime for doing that. But again, she put the black people in vans and denied them access to healthcare and dumped them in these crappy clinics. I actually visited some of these clinics in these dangerous strip malls. It was just awful. There's no way they got good healthcare. And Michelle told the black people, it's going to be good for you. It's better for you being in a crappy strip mall clinic than in an actual modern hospital. So once again, Michelle sold out the black community for a ton of money. So she has a horrible history in Chicago with the black community as a kid, refusing to study with them, running away from them for education, getting beat up by them. And as a adult in her career, she kicked them out of their homes and denied them access to healthcare. Now, in her book, Michelle doesn't talk about this very much, and she doesn't want you to know. That's why she's been making such an effort politically to try to pretend to be, I'm just one of these ordinary black folks from Chicago. I suffered discrimination. I was held back in life because of my skin color. I was a member of this community. It's all a bunch of lies to cover up the way she sold them out. Nobody sold out the black community like Michelle Obama. Now, what was the next chapter you asked about?
Well, and then you get into this black authenticity marriage crisis.
Yeah, so the Obamas, it's pretty interesting. So Michelle marries a biracial man, further distancing herself from the black community, a politician. She kind of marries her father. And Barack decides after being state senator for a few years, Michelle actually assists him because she's his treasurer. So she's totally into politics and wants him to become a state senator. And after 6 years of being a state senator, Barack decides he wants to go to Washington, the U.S. Congress, and he targets the seat of U.S. Congressman and former Black Panther Bobby Rush. Now, Rush had run for mayor and lost, so Barack thought he was vulnerable. And Michelle told him, no, Bobby Rush is a very beloved figure, former Black Panther. You cannot defeat Bobby Rush. Do not run against Bobby Rush. Barack insists on running against Bobby Rush for Congress. And also Dom Trotter ran as well. And Michelle says, I want nothing to do with this race. I'm not going to be your treasurer. I'm not going to go to fundraisers, nothing. It's a huge mistake. So Barack spends a ton of their money and runs up their credit cards running against Bobby Rush and loses. He goes, then Barack comes to the Democrat National Convention here in Los Angeles, flies out, spends all this money in hotels, and then he can't get into the convention. He didn't have a ticket. Michelle's mother, Marion, has to take out a $50,000 second mortgage on her home just to bail them out of their financial crisis because Barack ran for this office that he couldn't win. And Michelle is pissed. There's all these stories in the year 2000, how they supposedly, we've heard stories, there might have been talk of a divorce. They're not speaking to each other. And Michelle's absolutely furious. And I do delve into even more personal stuff, because during that time, that's when Michelle becomes pregnant with their second daughter, Sasha. Now, Michelle does write in her book about needing to go through IVF treatment for both daughters, starting with Malia, the older daughter. And she spends a chapter talking about all the difficulties of the treatment. It takes months. It takes a lot of cooperation with the husband to try to get pregnant through the IVF process. It takes several months. Now, all of a sudden, Michelle says she got pregnant again through IVF in the summer of 2000. And she just that's all she says in her book. She doesn't go into it at all. But it's kind of unlikely, I thought, that given the fact that they weren't on speaking terms, and Barack blew all their money, and she's really angry at him, they're talking about divorce, that they would have said, well, let's start this IVF process now. Pretty unlikely. So I did quite a bit of research, and though we don't have DNA, I think I made the case that the father of Sasha, the second daughter, might be Martin Nesbitt, who lived near them, close family friend, who's been with them for years, because he's a dead ringer. He looks just like Sasha. And maybe he was comforting Michelle a little too much when they were, on the outs. So I do make that case. And I actually asked Michelle's mother about that in the movie. I had the courage to ask her if Sasha was Barack's daughter. But I said, because she looks nothing like Malia, the other daughter, absolutely not even like half-sisters. They look nothing alike. And instead of throwing me out of her house, Michelle's mother agreed with me, So it's pretty interesting how I got into that personal side of what I think Michelle Obama may have been up to.
That's really one of the more interesting aspects of the whole story.
Yeah.
Because again, more lies. And so now the next race comes up, and the Obamas become these Hyde Park fashionistas, and they now aspire to live in Hyde Park, and Obama's going to make another run for the Senate. What happens?
Well, they decide Barack wants to run for Senate. Of course, now they're in Hyde Park in a beautiful home. Michelle says, got her on tape, she says Hyde Park is the best neighborhood. She's going to all the big Miracle Mile in Chicago, to all the fashionista stores, to the fashion designers like Ikram Goldman, Maria Pinto, who I visited in Chicago. Michelle has a celebrity hairdresser, Ronnie Flowers, who she's had since she was 18 years old. So Michelle is becoming quite famous for her style and all her fashionable clothes. She's on the Vanity Fair International Top 25 Best Dressed list. So they're living a life of pretty much white people in a white neighborhood. She works at the University of Chicago Medical Center. And Barack decides to run for U.S. Senate. He gets a big assist from David Axelrod, who had worked for his opponent and knew about his opponent's marital difficulties, and was able, when he came over to Barack, he helped publicize that his opponent had some nefarious goings on in his divorce that kind of knocked his opponent out of the race. So Barack was able to capitalize on that and have an easy win to become U.S. Senator. And Michelle started attending all these awards events and showing up as this big fashionista. And as soon as Barack got to the U.S. Senate, of course, part of that was the fact that he had become the keynote speaker for John Kerry at the 2004 Democrat convention. Introduced John Kerry. Barack told this story, which we know is totally phony. He said, my mother's from Kansas, my father's from Kenya. I'm going to bring us all back together. He promoted this personal story. And Barack's book, Dreams from My Father, took off selling. It was about 8 years old, but he now sold millions of copies, where he told his personal story and tried to base his candidacy on his personal story. In his book, Dreams from My Father, of course, Barack spends a lot of time talking about Frank Marshall Davis, the communist who raised him in Hawaii, but he doesn't actually tell us that part of the story. So, yeah, Michelle decides to stay in Chicago, and Barack can commute back and forth from Washington because she's still a bigwig at the University of Chicago Medical Center. And there's tremendous immediate talk of Barack, possibly running for president in 2008.
Yeah, the Chicago University of Chicago is in Hyde Park, as I recall, and it is probably one of the tonier upper class neighborhoods in Chicago. It's one of the most desirable places to live. That and the shore along Lake Michigan, and she's now showed up in both of these places, as well as Princeton.
Right, and her kids are going to the laboratory schools at the University of Chicago. It's like going to college when you're in kindergarten. It's just this incredible, expensive school that Michelle gets her kids in for free because she works there.
Right, and she's doing very well there, and Obama's off to Congress, and they're not spending very much time together. But then you come up with the Southside Girl campaign strategy.
That's right.
Now, explain that, because I think this is, again, one of the more fascinating parts of the book of the story.
Yeah, when Barack decides to run for president first he has to overcome Hillary Clinton in the primaries, he starts out, and he's really not getting any support from the black community. They're still with Hillary. Black people thought Barack was white because he was from Hawaii, he grew up in Indonesia, his parents were his mother's white. He grew up with his white grandparents. Black community doesn't think he's white. They're not buying into it. Now, white people thought he was black. They said, oh, that'd be kind of cool. Let's have a black president. He got some support mostly from white people. But the core voting group that he needed, which was black Americans, weren't buying into it. They didn't think he was black. He's not one of us. So Michelle really was the only one that could try to communicate to the black community, essentially to manipulate them, much as her father had done for many years, manipulating black community to vote for white liberals. Michelle had it in her blood and her experience to manipulate the black community with fake stories and fake promises. So Michelle shows up on the campaign trail for Barack early on in Iowa, and she doesn't show up wearing her Ikram Goldman clothes and looking like this beautiful fashionista. And she didn't show up and say, hey, I'm another Harvard lawyer like my husband. Look at all my great clothes and makeup. She shows up looking like a homeless person. She shows up, she doesn't comb her hair. It's a total mess. She wears an old sweater and a skirt to try to make people, at least in her mind, what she thought black people might dress like in the 50s. She tries to make herself look like some, 1950s black housewife. And she tries very hard to convince mostly targeting black voters that Barack is black to get their support. I've got her on tape in my movie. When she talks to black audiences, Michelle puts on a phony urban accent all of a sudden. She didn't talk like that at home, not at Harvard, not at Princeton, but she puts on a fake urban accent. She drops her G's. Instead of saying coming and going, she says coming and going, So Michelle puts on an act to trick black voters into thinking and Barack is black. She says, I'm from the south side of Chicago. I was held back in life. She tells her own personal story. Because of my skin color, my guidance counselor discriminated against me and racially profiled me for going to Princeton. I overcame. We're just like you. So that was the Southside Girl campaign strategy, to say I'm just this poor, underprivileged kid from the South Side that was held back, and I had to overcome all this, and just like one of you. So it was a complete phony story. Michelle's not from the South Side. She's a big fashionista. She had nothing to do with the black community growing up, and she exploited and abused them in her career. And that's the story that you find out in this book.
We're with Joel Gilbert, and he is the filmmaker and author of this Michelle Obama 2024. And it's a fascinating story. I'm encouraging everybody to watch the DVD, read the book, if you really want to understand who Michelle is. Joel has done an amazing amount of investigation. Now, as we continue this, we're getting more now into the current strategy, because your chapter 16 is Dividing America, Blackness for Political Gain. So how have the Obamas figured out how to exploit race for politics?
Well, when they got into office, Michelle dropped all of her, I'm a poor black girl from the Southside who doesn't comb her hair and wears old sweaters. She went right back to being this huge fashionista, hundreds of magazine covers and fashion sitcoms, giving hundreds of speeches. She did, when she spoke to black audiences, she would still put on the phony urban accent, which you can see in my film. But the big abuse of racial issues was when Obama was running for re-election. Now, when Obama was elected president, both blacks and whites in polls, 70% said race relations were good. By the time the Obamas left the White House, it flipped. Both groups, blacks and whites, with only 30% thought race relations were good. So the Obamas ruined race relations in America in order to further their political goals. What happened was, after 3 years of terrible administration by Obama, everything got worse. The economy was terrible. Minority communities in particular, there were no jobs. Illegals were coming into the inner cities, taking away jobs, driving down wages. And it really wasn't certain that blacks would come out again to support Obama for his reelection. And that's when we had that Trayvon Martin case, which I made a film called The Trayvon Hoax about, where Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman. And Obama sent the Justice Department down there, the FBI, Al Sharpton, and Obama said, if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon. And I chronicled how they used a fake witness to get Zimmerman arrested. Rachel Juntel, the big hefty, 200-pound heavier than Trayvon girl that was 2 years older than him, claimed to have heard things over the phone with Trayvon before he was shot, and that she was his girlfriend. And the prosecution said, well, let's ignore the eyewitness, and we'll use this girl's, what she said she heard over the phone, even after Zimmerman had been exonerated by the police. So they arrested Zimmerman, had this big trial. And I showed that Rachel Juntel was not his girlfriend. She wasn't on the phone with him. And in the movie, in the book also, I found out the real girlfriend was named Diamond Eugene, and she refused to lie to the police. She had met with Crump and the Martin family, but she refused to lie to the police, and that's when they used this fake witness. But Black Lives Matter was started because of the acquittal of that case. And Obama embraced Black Lives Matter, had him come to the White House, hands up, don't shoot. Everything came out of that. So that's how the Obamas, and especially Michelle, used race to inflame the black community to get them to vote for them. One particular story I show in the film is when Michelle told David Letterman, when she was on the Letterman show, about this fantastic, wonderful time she had going incognito out of the White House, wearing a baseball hat and sunglasses, to Target. And she said, a short woman asked me to get something off the top shelf. And I got it for her, and she told me, you didn't have to make that look so easy. And we both laughed. And Michelle's telling how a great time she had. And then a year later in Essence, or Ebony Magazine, or Essence, one of those, Michelle retells the story as a racial incident. She said, oh, because I was black, this woman asked me to get something off the top shelf. She doesn't say that she was short or that they both had a great time. So Michelle uses race. She lies about race. She hoaxes race. She tells hoax stories about Princeton and Target, because she knows that she can inflame black voters to polarize them to want to vote for a black candidate. And that's what the Obamas did in the White House, and that's how they ruined race relations in this country.
There's Valerie Jarrett with Michelle Obama. And right. Valerie Jarrett, of course, was one of Barack Obama's top advisors, born in Iran, Iranian family. Michelle goes, so Hillary loses the 2016 election to Donald Trump, and now the Obamas have to go to the inauguration and sit on the stage while Trump is being inaugurated, and Hillary's sitting there, a loser. And you write, Michelle goes low.
Yeah.
So talk about that.
Well, Michelle campaigned for Hillary Clinton, and she would just, the hypocrisy is ridiculous. First, she'd talk about how when they go low, we go high. People would cheer. Yeah, we're morally superior. We don't we don't do anything negative. So Michelle would talk about how when they go low, we go high. And then she'd launch into these blistering, fake, lies and attacks on Donald Trump about how he treats women and, all these awful things he does and says, and he makes fun of handicapped people. So Michelle has the ability to be very, very nasty. And her speeches were very, very nasty and anti-Trump. But she liked to let you know that she's still morally superior because when they go low, we go high. So Michelle tried very hard to get Hillary elected. She gave speeches to thousands of people. Michelle can fill up stadiums. She's that popular. She's the most popular person in the country. And of course, when Hillary lost, you saw the Obamas pouting a little bit during the inauguration of Donald Trump. And, when Trump was, leaving office, you might remember that the day after January 6th, it was January 7th, Michelle published a manifesto, 2-page manifesto, political manifesto on Twitter. And in that manifesto, she demanded that Donald Trump be dropped out of all social media, that he be canceled. And sure enough, the next day, big tech canceled Trump and removed him from Twitter and all the other platforms. So Michelle has been out there, and that's why I've maintained that I think she's planning to run for president, because as soon as Trump got elected, she started copying everything that Barack had done to become president. Michelle doesn't have any original ideas. She pretty much just copies what Barack does and says. Barack was the keynote speaker for John Kerry. Sure enough, Michelle was the keynote speaker that introduced Joe Biden at the 2020 convention. Barack wrote 2 autobiographies, The Light, Dreams from My Father and The Audacity of Hope. Michelle wrote Becoming and The Light We Carry. Both are on Netflix as movies as well. And of course, Barack had a voter registration organization in Chicago called Project Vote that established a lot of street cred for him before he ran for president. Michelle founded When We All Vote, voter registration organization, and got $26 million from George Soros for it. So I see her copying and mimicking everything Barack did, keeping herself in the public eye and keeping up her high profile. And I believe that it's because Joe Biden will step aside for one reason or another, health or being impeached or pardoning Hunter. And that's when that happens, the delegates that Biden would have earned become canceled and irrelevant. And the Democrat National Committee, then 200 people vote on the next nominee. And I'm certain that Michelle has positioned herself to be that nominee.
Well, and this whole book, The Becoming, which is her version of her life story, just like Dreams from My Father, was Barack Obama's story, like a legend of his life.
Yeah.
And you find in your next chapter here, which is the escape to Martha's Vineyard, that they move into a very, very exclusive section of Washington, D.C. They're going to stay in Washington, D.C. And then they end up buying this mansion in Martha's Vineyard. Again, another off of Massachusetts, another very upper class, very exclusive, largely white section of houses that our millionaires and billionaires live in. And they $12 million house that they buy, not worried particularly much about global warming, being on the edge of the water, with this house with a beautiful view of the, from Martha's Vineyard, which is a beautiful little island. So what's this all about?
Well, look, the Obamas, in their core, they are white liberals. Both of them grew up as white liberals. And of course, when they got a chance to spend $12 million on a beautiful summer home, they go to live with the exclusive bastion of white liberals in Martha's Vineyard. They buy the climate-denying house on the beach. But most of the year, of course, they do have that beautiful mansion in Washington, D.C., the first president who never left Washington. And it's because Obama continues to consult with members of Congress, with the Democrat Party, and lead the Democrat Party. And I think very much so. He's also driving the agenda in the Biden administration. Most of the staffers are his original staffers, including Biden himself. And that's what they've been up to during the Trump years. And, the Martha's Vineyard is just kind of a reflection of who they really are. They're not comfortable with black people or being around black people. They're comfortable with rich white liberals, which really is who they are. Michelle really is an Oreo, what the girls called her when she was growing up. You're black on the outside, but you're really white on the inside.
And the that house, I'll put that up again, Chris. I mean, we all, of course, have summer homes like this. Look at all the square footage, the mansion. This is the poor girl from the Southside, right?
Yeah, she's somebody. Look, she ran away to Hyde Park, Princeton, Harvard, Martha's Vineyard. It's just typical behavior for Michelle Obama. She never had any black friends, unless it was an elite like Santita Jackson, who was kind of light-skinned, and she was from an elite political family like she was. So that's Michelle's real story, and she spends a lot of time, and she's out there right now, still outreach to black and minority communities, trying to convince them that she's one of them, and give me the power, give me your votes. And that's Michelle's biggest vulnerability, I think, and it will be her biggest vulnerability as a candidate. Black people are pretty sensitive, as most people would be, to someone selling them out. And if they knew that Michelle sold them out, exploited them, and abused them for money in her career, I don't think they'd support her politically. So if I was Donald Trump, I would be tweeting every day, Michelle Obama, are you going to apologize to the black community in Chicago for what you did to them? Michelle, are you going to apologize for denying them access to health care? Michelle, what are you going to do about the 20,000 black people you kicked out of their homes? That would open a whole can of worms, and she's going to have to answer for it, because she's been promoting a phony story that she's just one of these ordinary black folks and was discriminated against. And she's selling that bill of goods to try to get political power.
Yeah, I say the picture you have even on the cover, when she's almost always seemed to have this anger inside, which they're trying to soften and do the public relations around. But I mean, look at it's almost like a fighting position. I mean, it's like she's so angry inside.
Well, she had a pretty difficult childhood in her neighborhood. The black kids would beat her up. I got her on tape. You can see in the movie. She said she's afraid to go out of her house. They accused her of talking white and acting white. And Michelle even said that acting white and talking white really meant that you had an attitude, that you think you're better than everybody else. Michelle had an attitude. She refused to study with other black kids. She had no black friends. And she ran away from them as fast as she could. And they treated her very poorly. And I think that's the psychology. Why would a black person take a job at the mayor's office to make 20,000 black people homeless? She had a lot of anger in her about how the black community treated her. She was afraid of them. And I think she wanted to get her revenge on them. And she did the same dirty work for the University of Chicago Medical Center. She dumped them and kicked them out of the hospital and dumped them in these strip malls. And she made a ton of money doing it, and she was happy to do it. She said, it's going to be good for you. That's how callous she was toward the black community. And I think if they knew about this, and I think people that watch my film and read my book, especially black viewers, they tell me, you know what? I knew it. I knew it. I knew it. There was something about her that wasn't authentic. And I think that'll open a can of worms.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, especially with the Bernadine Dorn connection, you know, these people, both Barack and Michelle, are very, very radical with a communist background, a revolutionary background.
They both picked it up in different ways. Barack started with I believe his real father, Frank Marshall Davis, was a Soviet agent and Communist Party member out of Chicago that radicalized him in his youth. So much so that Barack even admits, even though he went to Punahou, an exclusive high school in Hawaii, when he got to Occidental, 18 years old, he said, I went there to study with Marxist professors. Who would even know what a Marxist professor is? You know, but he was a revolutionary Marxist based on the radicalization from his father. Michelle was a little bit got into the radical stuff at Princeton, but kind of rejected it. And then Bernadine Dorn, on a personal level, I think was able to radicalize her in Chicago.
Yeah, and so if she gets to be president, what's her presidency going to be like?
I think it's Michelle's biggest thing is she's talked about suffering from imposter syndrome. It's this idea that you don't belong anywhere, and wherever you're located, people are going to realize you don't belong there. She's always feared that the white liberals, where she's lived with and worked with, will figure out that she's a big phony. So I think Michelle wants to get along. She wants to be accepted very badly. So I see her just following the same policies as Barack and Biden, the radical left policies, giving into the globalists, anything so that white liberals and globalists will accept her as belonging with them. So I think she'll try to appease and please them. So I'm just looking for everything to continue that Biden is doing and things to get worse.
What always amuses me, these people on the left who are social justice and It was poor and downtrodden, and what they lived is the life of the super rich oligarchs, and make enormous amounts of money for themselves. That they don't redistribute their money to the poor; they redistribute your money to the poor, and everybody ends up in a poorer situation altogether. The economy deteriorates, and Michelle and Barack buy another mansion.
Yeah, well, that's the definition of radical socialism. You have a group of elites that take all the property and use all your money and enrich themselves, and everybody else gets poorer. There's no more middle class. You just have one big lower class. And we know from the history of this over many years that in trying to create the perfect world, they end up having to murder millions of their own people who don't agree with this socialism. I mean, Bernardine Dohrn and Bill Ayers, they had a plan to put 50 million Americans in re-education centers. And part of their plan is whoever couldn't be re-educated, they estimated 25 million would have to be murdered. This is people in the 60s that had degrees from Columbia were talking like this. So these are the people that radicalized and indoctrinated Michelle and Barack Obama for years. So you can't underestimate how evil this socialist communist agenda is. And as I mentioned earlier, we heard Michelle in her podcast 2 weeks ago. She said, government does everything for us. And trickle down, that's her code word for free markets and capitalism, doesn't work. So the plan, if Michelle is elected, is going to be more socialism, more communism.
And more government power, more government expansion into our lives.
Correct.
Joel's done a remarkable job, and I encourage everybody to watch the DVD. It's really very entertaining, and it's eye-opening. And the book is quite well written. They go together, give you more detail, and give it to you in a written form. And I think, Joel, you've done a tremendous amount of work. I also compliment you for anticipating this, being really one of the first to. Now I see over and over, almost everybody's talking about Michelle now running for president.
Well, she's the most beloved Democrat. No one wants Biden. Every age group, every ethnicity, minorities, they don't want Biden. He's too old. He's had a disaster of a policy, economy, inflation, borders, international wars. Nobody wants Biden. And Michelle is the obvious choice. And I think she's positioned herself perfectly for this to go down sometime in the summer.
Well, our guest today has been Joel Gilbert, and please do get his DVD. This whole story about Michelle is quite revealing. It's going to be discussed in the campaign, and you get in on the story early, so you're cued in on the backside of what's going to be happening over the next few months.
Let me tell you where to go see it. It's salemnow.com. You can live stream or get the DVD on salemnow.com. Amazon Prime Video, you can watch also live stream. And then the DVD and book versions are available on Amazon.com.
And what's your website?
The website that you're looking at there on the screen, it's Michelle Obama 24, MichelleObama24.com. You can watch the movie trailer, read about everything, and that'll link you up to these sites to get the book and the DVD or live stream.
Joel, thanks for being with us today. We really appreciate it. And we'll have you back as the campaign gets going. And
okay.
As I say, in the end, God always wins. God will win here too, but it's what in the end means. We may be going through the judgment of God. We may be going through some very difficult times. And if the Obamas get back in power, I think it's going to be a continuation of more government tyranny because this is really where these people live.
Well, it's coming with Michelle. And of course, the media are going to use not only race against people who don't agree with socialism like they did with Obama, but they'll use race and gender. If you don't agree with Michelle, well, you're not, you're sexist and racist. So it's going to be difficult to oppose her agenda. And I think the media are salivating for the opportunity to support her against anyone else who disagrees with her.
So you're expecting a switcheroo at the last minute, and Biden says, "Oh, I'm not going to run again," and in comes Hillary saying, "I didn't want to run, but the party needs me."
Michelle, I think she'll kind of did like Trump, say, "Hey, I had this great life, but I want to help bring us back together," like Barack. And we had great times. Remember the Obama years, how great it was. We didn't have any scandals. I think sometime between the summer and the convention, which they put in Michelle's hometown, very big signal in Chicago, I think we'll see Biden drop out for health or any number of reasons. And that's when I think the party will turn to Michelle, who will pretend to be a little reluctant and then agree to do us all a big favor.
One last question. Did the Obamas ever live in that house that Resgo helped them buy in Hyde Park?
Yeah,
I mean,
they lived there. Yeah, they lived there for a couple of years. And then when Barack became U.S. Senator, Michelle stayed living there, and Barack would commute to Washington. So they did live in Hyde Park for several years. They still own that house. It's still there. Secret Service still guards it. And Michelle said the best neighborhood is Hyde Park. She wants nothing to do and never wanted anything to do with the South Side of Chicago.
Joel, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks so much.
This is Dr. Jerome Corsi with The Truth Central, and we are doing podcasts every weekday. Thank you for joining us. God bless.